Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where mental health professionals talk about their own mental health journeys and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. Today, I am joined by another licensed marriage and family therapist, which I'm always super stoked to chat with. Today, I'm joined by Amber Kerby. Amber, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Super stoked to talk to you today. We have a bunch of different topics we can go over, but I always start in the same place, which is just how'd you get into the mental health field? What was it that drew you to this work?
Yeah. I've been reflecting on that because I feel like my story has shifted a little bit over the years because my life has shifted, my practice has shifted. But I think initially what really drew me in was some work that I was doing already with a lot of families, a lot of teens. I actually was a youth pastor for a moment in my life, and I found myself constantly in the same position of being a space holder and a listener for all these teens, and then knowing like, ooh, your family, your parents need to know about this. Can we have more of these discussions? And then it just kind of came to this point in my life where it was an organic pivoting point. And my lovely husband was actually the one who said, listen, you need to continue to go to school for this. This is really good. This is really good what you're doing. You're passionate about it. So let's build on it. So I went back and got my master's degree and built a practice really working with primarily teens and kids and families initially. Always loved the systems, understanding that we're not on an island. And so it really is important to constantly bring in social connection and relationships at all times in therapy.
Yeah. And I love having therapists who've been in the field for a minute because I do think our stories change the longer we've been in it. And you accumulate kind of these different tools and these different ways of practicing. Going back to school is a thing I think we say in society, but it's like a jumping off point. It is not its own process. What you get from your master's is the first 2 sessions. You know how to do an intake and a diagnosis. And then when you get in the actual field, it's like, oh, wait, what else do I do?
Yeah, now what?
Yeah. Which is kind of, I think, where you and I connected in the first place. I found your Instagram and Nonordinary Therapy jumped out to me, which is a lovely handle, but kind of doing different things for trauma and working with people with Ketamine Assisted Therapy and all this stuff. So kind of once you got into that counseling field, that systemic lens, what was it that was like, oh, I need to go get more training, or I need to go focus on this thing? Kind of walk us through that journey.
Yeah. I think it was a combination of, really a perfect storm of personal and professional shifts happening at a specific time in my life where, I had moved. I was doing a lot via telehealth. I was a new mom. There was just so many things happening where I knew things in my practice had to shift. And I was becoming more and more exposed to this idea of ketamine assisted therapy and psychedelic assisted therapy and how effective it was. And really seeing things roll out in my personal life with people close to me, really, really witnessing the amount of changes that can happen. So as a practitioner, it just feels like I'm doing a disservice to my clients if I know that there's something else out there that can be really effective, but I don't know anything about it or I can't provide it. So that led me down this whole path of like, okay, what is happening with all of these non-ordinary therapies, and how do I really become more knowledgeable and ultimately trained? Because it just became incredibly relevant with everything that I was doing, that like this is the perfect point to say, we're going to do something different. And it might feel a little radical. I know it's not for everyone. The Midwest can be a tricky place to roll this thing out. And yet I've also found so many contacts, so many networks where people are ready and they're curious and they want to support it. So that really, opened up my eyes to see more and more, and especially with clients who I felt like I was kind of hitting a wall with. It'd been years. We're talking about this trauma. We're talking about the same things over and over. And, their ability to reduce symptoms and to really achieve some sort of sustainable change was just grueling for all of us.
Yeah.
And so to be able to introduce something that could work for them and really help them to get unstuck and change the narrative was life-changing for me and for so many clients, thinking, oh my God, I've been doing this for 10 years and now it's all different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you talk about a move thrown in there and then
Yeah.
having kid thrown in there,
Yes.
which is a topic that I like to talk about because it's one of those things that I think maybe this is what you mean by ordinary therapy and doing non-ordinary therapy. But I do think there's this perception that therapists are kind of that old Freudian expert who sits on one couch, your client lays down on the other couch, and like we don't have lives as therapists. Like we're just
Right.
professionals.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's I love to talk about and normalize, like, right, we have kids. Before I hit record, my toddler wandered down the stairs here. Like that's a very real experience that our clients deal with, and
Mm-hmm.
normalizing some of that like, right, we as professionals have that stuff too. Moving is a real life stressor that most people
Yeah.
experience that upends your life. And
Yeah.
so like getting to this point where like, right, it's not therapist versus client. It's we're all in this together as kind of human beings going through similar experiences.
Yeah, it feels so much like a co-creation. I mean, the idea that I think a lot of times we are taught in our master's level programs about, not disclosing personal information, really trying to be more of that blank slate, so to speak, isn't always helpful with a lot of our
Yeah.
clients. So showing up as humans with other humans is an incredible therapeutic tool right there, for everyone involved. I like to laugh with my clients who are pursuing ketamine assisted therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy in other legal parts of the US that, really my first ego death was becoming a mom. It had nothing to do with psychedelics or medications, but it really is, this notion that we can normalize the non-ordinary with the ordinary. The fact that like these life changes, these transformational changes can occur in so many different ways. And we can bring that into therapy and really talk about what's happening with people when we have these huge movements, whether it's, addition of family or moves or grief work because of loss and trauma. Just an incredible amount of content can come out of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm always curious kind of what I think I'm building a reputation of complaining about grad school, but
Yeah.
like what did your program prepare you for around this stuff? Like how much of this
Well,
was like, oh man, I got into the field and then was like, I don't have enough tools in my toolkit to work with this.
yeah. Yeah. Love, hate with the grad school. I totally get why it's there and what it's doing. And the system itself is, it's got its complications like every other system we as humans have put together. So
Mhm.
I think, what I can really credit my grad school experience for is helping me to develop my platform as a therapist, getting, a lot of these basic skills, understanding what therapy is about, understanding even how to start managing a private practice, which I know not all grad schools do. I was very lucky to be exposed to a lot of people who built that in to our discussions,
Sure.
how to be a standalone therapist, so to speak. But what I really found myself facing was this idea of like, okay, well, if I'm going to engage in non-ordinary therapy, I'm going to need some different tools. So I love that I had that foundation of like, okay, I can be a therapist.
Right.
I got that. Now, how do you do this in a context that isn't how we're trained? It's not CBT. It's not systemic approach. It does look very different when I'm engaging with clients in ketamine assisted therapy. So I engaged in a year-long program to really help me figure out what that nuance was. where to bring in this therapeutic base that I've already got, and then how to show up in ways that we don't always focus on as therapists, and how to navigate this non-ordinary space.
Yeah. Yeah. What is, I'm going to say maybe a hot take, and I would love to get your opinion on it. I always felt like psychology, the field itself, was working so hard to present itself as a hard science,
Yeah.
that there was almost this overcompensating of, we need to show up as a science.
Yes.
And that had nothing to do with clients. That had everything to do, I think, with academia. And then like, it wasn't until I got in my internship where somebody was like, this is an art. Like, how we interact with these people who come into our room and want help is an art, and the science matters. Not dismissing that.
Yes.
But and I think that goes back to then some of the ways that like psychedelics were criminalized in the United States, and the history of those things that had nothing to do with science, but probably had more to do with politics and racism, and getting to a point where like, right, we're starting to slowly trickle some research around psychedelics. I'm in Wisconsin. You're in Iowa. These Midwest states where weed's not even legal yet.
Right.
But, our big research institution, UW-Madison in Wisconsin, is studying psilocybin. So like, there's this weird juxtaposition of like, science matters, and it's an artwork to do therapy and to build relationship with people, and like, we're trying to navigate all the systemic levels of society that have made things like psychedelics or some of these indigenous or natural forms of healing almost criminal in some cases, that then we're trying to say, no, like, let's get back to some of the science and study this stuff and see how it can be helpful.
Yeah. You hit it on the head, really, the complexity of what this field is really about. It has to be a marriage between science and art. I think it was Jung that said something to the effect of like, know all the theories, but when you're with another human, just be another human. And that is, just paramount to what it means to be a therapist. So I think it's just incredibly essential that anyone in our field is constantly checking in with their own balance of like, okay, I've got the science base, I've got this theory, that makes a lot of sense, but then what is this flow like? Because no other human is walking in my office like, oh yeah, I understand this is how the theory is supposed to roll out, and I'll just stick to that plan. That is not ever how it works, because humans are messy and therapy is messy. So being able to always, hold both of these as our truths, but also realize that there's this flexibility. And I feel like that's kind of how we're moving with this idea of psychedelic assisted therapy, where we're really trying to feel out where that flexibility is. Give us enough science to really back up the safety and efficacy of this kind of treatment, and then also allow for so much navigation where we can welcome in indigenous wisdom, where we can really welcome in anywhere from the medical model, because that's going to make sense to people, to the ceremonial model, because that's going to make sense to people. Ultimately knowing this is about healing, and that's going to look different for everyone.
Yeah. And it's kind of mirroring your story. Like, when I started out, I was raised fundamentalist Christian, and so I worked at a Christian counseling place. Was the first place that I got a job at. And as I kind of deconstructed and moved away from the church, I got my specialty in religious trauma, and I had all these clients coming to me like wanting to do psychedelics, or they already had a retreat planned, or their friend out of state had mushrooms that they wanted. Like, I think one of the things that goes along with this is like the wealth of knowledge people have with the internet, where now it's not a Freudian or a Jung or even Carl Rogers or some of those older experts had this knowledge. Now it's everyone has access to the knowledge. And how do we as professionals help guide people through kind of the changing seas of, this is what we know with research, and this is what we know about healing. What does that look like for your life specifically?
Yeah. And that's a piece that I'm so passionate about, this idea that, we as as therapists and mental health practitioners can really be a resource in a space for our clients to start even discovering what that's going to mean for them. I don't think every therapist is going to want to practice some sort of ketamine assisted therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy, and that's totally okay. But I think it's so essential that we're aware that this is emerging and that we're doing our own due diligence in the research and understanding, okay, this is what's happening, here's the risks, because all of that can be a part of the conversation with our clients, especially around harm reduction. If I know a client's going to go hang out with a friend this weekend and engage in some sort of use, well, I kind of want to know that. And I want this to be a safe space for them to disclose that, to explore that. And can we, position them in a way that that's going to be more beneficial than harmful? And I think that's a huge piece that we're missing. I can definitely speak to my area, to the Midwest. We are just not as knowledgeable. We're not as aware of some of these emerging treatments. It can be very tricky to even talk about it here. So, I understand why some clinicians are not really digging in and they're not asking the questions. Because they maybe just don't feel like they've got enough to back up some sort of opinion, other than just what we were raised with, right? Like, I'm a kid of the DARE program. Drugs are bad. Like, stay away from that.
Which we have research that says that program failed horribly.
Right? Yes, I laugh every time, they still put it in the paper, like, these kids graduated from the DARE program. I'm like, okay, why are we still doing this? This is not everything.
You bring up an interesting point that I wanted to ask you about. Like, because you do some trainings for therapists, specifically for mental health providers in working with something like ketamine. What is the feedback you get from the professional spaces that you exist in from other therapists who are interested in it or maybe opposed to it, or what's the feedback you get?
Yeah. Overwhelmingly positive. Even from the people who have come to maybe a talk that I've had very skeptical. It doesn't mean that they've totally changed their mind, which is very okay. But the fact that they were there and they were open enough to receive some different information, and it really, I think, spurs people on to just doing more research, and digging into what's actually out there. I've been really, really lucky that the workshops that I've been hosting are generally people who aren't coming in with a lot of skepticism anyway. They're coming in with a lot of openness and curiosity. Many of the people who are coming in for the workshops are also people who are saying, all right, I've got clients in ketamine clinics right now, and I don't know how to talk about this. I don't know how to work with this. As far as integration goes, how do I help them really figure out what this is? So that's a huge part of my trainings as well, just trying to equip therapists with enough knowledge to understand what's going on with that sort of medicine, what goes on with the process, and give them tools to begin working with their clients to normalize, to validate, and begin figuring out what are the action steps here? How are we actually going to use this to make sustainable change?
Yeah, and I think that speaks well to clients who are not all of them, but a lot of them are doing a lot of their research and are trying to figure this out. Because again, once I started advertising as a religious trauma therapist, I started having people saying, I'm doing this thing on the side, or I'm microdosing, or I'm doing X, Y, or Z, because that's a thing in the religious trauma community. And people who have left organized religion but still want some spirituality, like, a lot of them are going to land around some version of ceremony or ritual or some sort of substance enhanced experience. And so it was one of those things where, kind of what you're talking about, like, I as a clinician was like, I'm aware of this, that it exists, but I'm not trained in how to help my clients kind of navigate it. And so I think that's good, but also existing in the Midwest, I think it is rare. I think I'm still battling sometimes just the stigma of coming to therapy, let alone
talking about anything outside the realm of what we call normal here.
Right. Right. And the normal, put it in quotes for the people who are just listening, the normal is arbitrary. It's based off of a bizarre system of what the DSM was designed to be, that then insurance companies took it over. And it's a very strange in itself unscientific system of what we've kind of landed as like, this is okay treatment and this is not.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and as a LMFT, maybe you can relate. Like, part of the reason I started my own practice is just frustration with dealing with insurance companies, because doing couples therapy, just couples therapy, nothing else, nothing non-ordinary about that other than there's two people in the room,
Yes.
was just a nightmare to get more than 6 sessions, more than 8 sessions. And I
Mhm.
would love to say I'm that good of a therapist. Occasionally I am, but I cannot say that I always get through couples work in 8 sessions. Sometimes we're
Yeah.
just digging into the deep stuff in session
Right.
7 or 8.
Yes. Yeah, I think that was an eye-opening and super frustrating moment in my own grad school and initially starting out phase, where, you know, in the DSM, we've got all these codes specifically for couples therapy and relational issues, and it turns out none of those are ever reimbursable by insurance
Yeah.
companies. So now
Yeah.
we have to play this weird game in order to really support our clients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every couple I had an adjustment disorder,
Yeah.
shockingly.
Yes. Pretty much every human I meet has an adjustment disorder.
Yeah.
So,
And for those non-therapists, those few of you who aren't
right.
therapists and tune in, the DSM is a diagnostic manual, which again isn't what it was designed to be. It was supposed to just be a research tool, but that's what insurance companies use to reimburse therapists. And so it is this bizarre world that we learn in grad school how to navigate that. I was lucky to have an internship that also was housed within Family Therapy Training Institute. So
Yeah.
I got my master's and postgrad back to back and kind of just learned how to do it systemically. But right, I was taught, yes, there's the V code, ignore it. It doesn't matter. Like, you can't get paid using that. So
Yeah.
here's how you're going to diagnose. You're going to start here and then build anything else from there. And it was so,
Mhm.
I speak very highly of my education, like my trainers and my supervisors. They taught me well how to use a broken system,
Yes.
but like that didn't address the broken system.
Yes. And that, you know, I think that skill too has followed me into what I'm doing now, because psychedelic assisted therapy, ketamine assisted therapy is not covered under insurance. So there's this whole system that we have built, supposedly built to really support our clients, because most people can't pay out of pocket for long-term services. And yet we really have to pinpoint what's the legal and ethical way to provide the services and be able to utilize benefits within this broken system that we have.
Yeah.
So, you know, another huge part of the talks, the trainings that I provide is having these conversations with other clinicians. Like, I'm aware that this is what we have to work with. So how do we do that? And how do we continue kind of pushing this
Yeah.
in a way that encourages the system to make changes at some point in the next million years, but also like really gets this out, you know, to our community, because these are viable options for so many people looking for something that works. And to have like a price tag be an obstacle is incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. And it puts us as providers, not that we're the victims in it, but it does put us in a ethical quandary. Like, I'm somebody who doesn't take insurance at all, and I
Yeah.
don't love that. And in that intersectionality piece of like, I have 2 small children. My wife is stay-at-home mom because
Yeah.
childcare is expensive, and it's all these moving parts where it's like, right, I'm not in this to get rich, and also I exist under capitalism as well, and
Yes.
navigating that broken system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It
Really. And yeah, really with this kind of idea of like a fair exchange as
Mhm.
well. You know, and I have a lot of always fun conversations with social workers about these kinds of topics,
Yeah.
because there is, you know, there is a difference between licensure and training, and, you know, the different aspects that we're really getting into when we're providing these services. Um, but yeah, constantly having this discussion of, is this a fair exchange? You know, as a professional, how are you feeling in all of
Mhm.
this? How are you utilizing the system that we do have? How are you operating under capitalism? Are you getting your bills paid? And are we also providing services in a way that show the value and begin to kind of create some friction. Because without that friction, no one's going to change.
Right.
So we really do have to kind of find that edge, and that edge is going to be moving constantly.
Yeah. And I think starting out in agency work and seeing some of that stuff, like there were plenty of therapists who just chatted with their clients for 50 minutes and they saw them for several years, and it was, $20 copay and then insurance covered it. And like, I don't know what they were doing.
Right.
I always tell clients, like, I don't want to have lifers, and like with a lot of love and space for all of my clients, I don't want to see them for multiple years.
Right.
Sometimes there are things, trauma is one of those variables, one of those X factors that might make things take longer, but like not for life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I don't feel like I'm doing my job if I'm seeing a client and we're talking about the same thing. I'm utilizing the same interventions over and over. If it's not working, if our relationship isn't working, then I really want to get them to a place where something will work. And it's okay if it's not with me. Perhaps we need to have a conversation with someone else. Maybe there's a different intervention or a different modality to try. I'm the same way. I'm not in this to have the same conversations about what was for dinner and what's up with mom-in-law. I don't want to do that over and over again. I really, it's funny, like I'm trying to work myself out of a job constantly.
Yeah, that's part of my informed consent. That's why I'm laughing when you say that. Like that's how I introduce the informed consent. Not how I introduce it. It is a piece of my informed consent in that like my goal is to make myself not needed. Like that's how I approach this process.
Yes.
A little bit of a left turn. You also do internal family systems.
I do.
Which is super trendy right now. Somebody was telling me, a younger therapist was telling me it's like a 18-month wait list just to get in with the training right now. So I don't know if it's pervasive in our culture that IFS is a big deal, but I think it's getting there, but certainly among providers, like this is a big deal. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of how you got into IFS, how you were exposed to it, and what you did to do all of that training and certification too?
Right. I did it all in one shot. So I honestly like blanked out an entire year of my life. I have no idea what was happening. I was just learning a lot. I assume people got fed and got to places where they needed to be, but I was holed up, like really learning. I think for me, I was exposed to IFS. I think it was really before I started doing too much of my training and research with psychedelic assisted therapy, but it was more of a personal interest because it spoke my language. IFS, internal family systems. Heck yes, I love all of that. Especially during the time where I was doing a lot of my own introspective work and really trying to figure things out in a completely different way. So it was through a personal experience with IFS that just totally lit up that whole aha. I see where this is going, which is so interesting because it's not at all how I used to work with any of my clients. In fact, I remember learning about IFS in grad school and I thought, this is a little kooky. I'm going to memorize what I have to memorize, but I'm not using this. And then it finally hit for me that this was like super effective. And so, of course, it just all started coming together with my training as well. And all the research was saying, oh, turns out a modality like IFS is a perfect complement to what's happening in psychedelic assisted therapy and ketamine assisted therapy. So I thought, well, I'll just throw my hat in this whole like lottery to try to get trained. And I was one of the lucky ones. That got accepted in my first round of the lottery. So apologies to all of you who've been waiting for years to get in. I know. So I did all of that at once and absolutely love it. And I just finished up my level 2 actually with the couples version of internal family systems, IFIO, or intimacy from the inside out. So it's pretty much all I do right now. And I count that as a non-ordinary therapy because the work that we're doing with the internal systems feels very non-ordinary. It's not CBT. It's not a top-down approach. I'm really encouraging people to go within their own system and talk more and more about the things that we don't talk about in a way that just normalizes it and creates this connection internally and, you know, in a relationship as well when I've got a couple or a group in the room. Yeah. So it's been, I mean, it was an incredibly transformational year when I just dove headfirst into all the trainings and restructured my entire practice.
Yeah. And you said a little earlier you had some exposure in grad school to the business side of things, which you highlighted is a rarity. I don't know, this is episode 40, 41, I'm not sure. But I interviewing a lot of therapists at this point now, like it is a trend because I try and interview people who are private practice owners. It's a trend that, like, right, most of us are kind of figuring out the business stuff on the fly, and it's a kind of learn as you go type thing. Because for a lot of training programs, you're just going to go into agency work. Like that is the way it is taught, and that's the expectation. So what was that like, owning your own practice and then kind of being like, oh, well, now I'm switching how I'm doing things. Can you talk a little bit about the business side of that?
Yeah. You know, and I want to give a shout out too to the school I went to. I went through Capella University, which is an accredited online school, and I did it at a time that online school was like not a cool thing. So it's kind of funny. I'm like, there's a lot of non-ordinary happening in my whole path here. But I think it was through that. I mean, so many of the instructors in my program were currently active therapists, a lot in private practice or with organizations doing research, versus some of the typical academia where you have professors, but they're not currently practicing. So shout out to Capella for really getting me in contact with, you know, faculty where I could say right off the bat, like, I'm not going in to all of these other organizations. I'm going in for private practice. And then these people could really offer a lot of resources. So the business side of things, you know, I still had to pick up a lot on the fly. Especially switching states, figuring out licensure, where my business needs to be, all the different business structures. That's a fun game to play. And it felt kind of risky at the time as well, knowing that I was going to switch how I practice kind of in the middle of COVID and everything else that was happening in a state where I really didn't know if it was going to take off. Because I was having a really difficult time even having conversations with, you know, medical providers about ketamine. So I thought, ooh, if this is happening on the medical level and on the therapeutic level, what's the community going to say? Do I need to like move my practice like an hour away just in case? Like what's really going to go down? But honestly, the feedback, the initial feedback and interest that I had was incredibly encouraging. And it really helped that transition to feel more comfortable. Yes, still risk. There were still a lot of conversations with current clients about, you know, even switching from the way I was working with them to utilizing more IFS and what that can sound like and what that can look like, and being able to connect people, you know, with other providers who said right off the bat, like, that doesn't feel right for me, and I really want to pursue this. So there's, of course, a lot of prep work in that. But I just knew for me that I couldn't in good conscience sit there and do the same thing with a client that just didn't resonate with me. It doesn't feel good for me. It doesn't feel good for them. It's not going to be helpful overall. So it really was essential that I began making those shifts and allowing a lot of space and time for that. It's not like I just popped in a session. I was like, okay, so you're used to this, but now we're going to talk about the parts of you. Like, wait, what happened here? A lot of it was just very organic, the way that I talked, and the way that we were kind of able to infuse so much of it into the conversations we were already having. You know, even now, last week I was meeting with a client that I've had for a bit, And we haven't done a lot of explicit IFS work, but yet our conversation, they were really talking about this part of me and then that part of me. And for anyone
Yeah.
who knows IFS, that is very much the language we use. So it was just kind of a cool moment to really see how everything had shifted in this nice organic way. And they were still, finding it beneficial. They were still making progress, and it was still kind of in their realm of comfort as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for as educated as clients, I think are coming in about mental health in general, they're not aware if we're doing DBT or ACT or, like I do collaborative language therapy, which most therapists haven't heard of because it's one of those niche postmodern things. And we're like, oh, postmodern is narrative. Like, well, and other things.
Yes.
So yeah, some of that jargon I think is lost on them, but definitely they pick up on how we as providers and helpers are showing up authentically or not.
Yes.
And you come from a background working with a lot of teens. I have a specialty in sports performance, and I worked with college students for many years while I was in higher ed doing mental health. And I've said for years, like teens have a really good BS radar. Like you can't show up and lie to them or tell them something that you don't buy into either.
Right. Yeah. And I'm a terrible liar. I can't do it. We laugh about it all the time in my house. I'm like, it's not going to happen. So if I have a client just saying, hey, is there more that can help me? Yes, there is. Here's what I know, and I want to share that. Yeah. So I think overall, it's incredibly important that we as clinicians remember that we're just as an important part as a human in our own authenticity, showing up with other people, because it's not just the theories. It's not, the recipe that's going to produce like, oh yeah, if you just follow the science, it will end up okay. Not always the case.
Yeah. If it was that easy, we would not have careers in the first place.
Right.
Well, and I work with a lot of clients who have seen other therapists. I think it's on my website, like whether I'm your first or 15th therapist. And I get a lot of feedback like, oh, you are much more involved than my other therapists. And again, like I don't want to speak poorly of the profession or the field, but I do think we can do better as the field and people who are seeking out trainings and adding trainings and doing things differently. I've had a number of therapists who do like walk and talk therapy or nature informed therapy and all these different modalities that we are not taught in grad school.
Right.
And the more authentic we as providers are and find these avenues to practice in a way that is genuine to us, the more benefit it is to our clients. And there's multiple mental health crises going on right now. And so the clients are there. There are not enough providers for the people who need help. And so it's, I think, moving away from that scarcity mindset and that like competitive capitalistic mindset that we're like competing for clients. The people are there. It's a matter of finding the people who will mesh well with us in the way we want to practice.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think too, this opens up so many different conversations among professionals about ethical guidelines. There really have been a lot of interesting avenues around dual relationships and self-disclosure and all of these hard lines that we're generally taught in grad school, like don't do any of that, like stay away from all of it. And then it turns out in practice, there's actually a different flow that can happen. It can happen among practitioners. So I have a ton of respect for people who say, no, these are my lines, they're over here, they're hard and fast, and I will not go over those. That's great. That's authentic to them. That's how they want to practice. That feels good for them. And they'll work really well with a certain type of client. And then, of course, I know other practitioners who are like, well, there's a little bit more nuance here. And here's kind of how I allow this. And here's the safety protocol here. And I want to make sure that that's backed up there. And they're going to mesh well with other clients. So that whole idea, too, of scarcity and competition, when we as clinicians really settle into who we are, how we practice, where our lines are, that's going to automatically bring in the type of people that we're going to work well with. And I don't
Right.
need to be competing with someone who's on the other end of the spectrum doing something totally different. Like, I'll send people over there. You do that. I don't want to do
Right.
that. Here's what I do. So people
Yeah.
who are looking for that will find me. And there really is just an incredible amount of opportunity for clinicians to find these different, niches and really their own voice in their own practice, and offer that in a way that's going to be so much more effective for clients in their own healing.
Yeah. Yeah. And tying in some of the business piece, like your clients get more self-selective. Like
Yes.
I have some type A people on my caseload because I do couples therapy.
Yeah.
But usually it's the not type A person who picks me, because like that's apparent if you go on my socials or you go on my website. Like, right, I'm not the person who's doing a worksheet every session. Like I have a workbook in my office that I refer to sometimes. But
Yes.
it's one of those things where, like, right, I want a client who's not looking for that, and a client who doesn't want that, I want them to be able to find me, as opposed to, I think, that scarcity mindset or that agency mindset of we need to serve everyone who walks through the door,
Yes.
which I think ends up being a disservice if we don't have a good fit or somebody whose scope of practice really addresses that need that client has.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that was definitely a big piece, of my own process as a new therapist, not wanting to say no to anyone. Like, I'm trying to build my practice. So, oh, you're
Right.
looking for that? Yeah, sure, I can do that. Oh, you want this? All right, yeah, I can get supervision. That'll be fine. And then really, even noticing like what was on my website, and beginning to even redo so much of the wording now. Even now, I'm still
Yeah.
going through a lot of content and ensuring, like, is this my voice? Is this really how I practice? Or is this the old language where it's like, yep, I just need clients. So please come in with whatever you have and I can help you.
Yeah.
And really leaning on that confidence that I'm trained, this is effective, it's authentic for me, and this is what I'm saying yes to, knowing
Yeah.
that I have a ton of referrals for anyone who's just searching and they're like, I don't know, I found your name, but that doesn't seem like an approach I want to use. Great. Well, here's 5 other people
Right.
who may be able to help you.
Yeah.
But I think it's just a big piece too for upcoming new therapists. Like, we want to say yes to everybody. We're trying to build a practice, and then coming to that point of deciding, like, okay, actually, this is the way that I work. And
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah. And I love the non-ordinary moniker because, again, I think there's such a different, it's all on a spectrum. So like when I took those trainings on opening a business, on private practice stuff, because I had no business background. Like, I have ADHD. A lot of that stuff is super neurotypical and was not helpful for me, and wasn't what I ended up doing, is not the way my website looks, is not how I do my marketing. And so having this idea of like, hey, like, there's a constructed way of doing this that society has said this is normal, but there's other options. Like, there's things that we can do, and there's ways that we can build it so that it will take care of itself.
Yes.
And I think that's just, I love that. I think that's really freeing. It took me, even though I had that knowledge and I would say that stuff to clients, to break some of that like formal training on like, don't give your client cell phone number and all this other stuff of like, right, I've been doing this for years. I know that doesn't matter. I'm going to show up the way that I want to show up.
Yes. Yeah. And I think too, kind of normalizing this idea of non-ordinary, really seeing the system and the treatment protocol for what we have. It's effective for 30, maybe up to 50% of people, maybe, right? Depending on which research you're looking at. So knowing that our method, our model is a good start, and it can be super helpful for a lot of people, but it's not the only answer. So, those with treatment-resistant depression, oh my goodness, they're wondering what on earth is wrong with them, that these 12 medications and these 20 therapists didn't work for them. And it's time to really build up this network of alternative, non-ordinary healing spaces where we can utilize different approaches, We can find integrative ways. There are so many integrative ways to really bring in the models that we have. They're not inherently bad.
Right.
We just need more because we're not okay. We're not
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. And I think, right, that social norm that you go and get an antidepressant, which like those of us who are in the know are only about 30% effective, which is at the rate of a placebo. And I'm
Yeah.
not dismissing that they work for some people. I'm just highlighting that like they work for less people than your prescribing physician probably pretends they do.
Yeah.
And normalizing that, because I do think where that lands is on the client's shoulders, that they've done something wrong, or they're extra broken or bad or in the wrong somehow, when it's like, no, this system is designed and has been researched predominantly by white men. And so like, yeah, there's a lot of people that we haven't covered in that. So like, here are some other options.
Yeah, and the fact too that our system is really built on symptom alleviation or symptom reduction versus true healing. So I'm not opposed to my clients saying, oh my gosh, I need some extra help with these symptoms so I can continue doing this work. Okay,
Right.
let's do that. But let's really put this in a framework where these kinds of strategies are here to help you, but it's not here to just solve the problem and make it all
Right.
go away. So if you want to go throughout life numb and disconnected, okay, I have a great strategy for you. But it turns out most humans actually want more and they want something different. Yeah, so I think it's just so important that we are continuing to have those conversations about the models that we have, what it's really there for, what these, models and what these medications are there for, and saying, hey, this is okay. They fit here, and there's more. We have other options. Turns out, like, we have to do some work too, to get to where we want.
Yeah. Yeah. And that segues nicely into my next question is what does your work look like? How do you kind of take care of yourself when you're not with clients or in between sessions? What does self-care look like? What does cultivating joy look like? What do you kind of do to take care of yourself?
Yeah. So I had this crazy notion a couple years ago that I was going to do this whole work-life balance thing where I would have these set hours of work time that happen to mirror when my kiddo's in school. So when we're done with school, we're done with work and we are together as a family. And putting a lot of boundaries in place, really for me to not cross over my own boundaries was essential. And that's really freed me up to really cultivate this balance in my own system of what it means to be a therapist and what it means to be a partner, what it means to be a mom, what it means to be a friend, ensuring that I've got space in my life for all of that. And I think too, joy and self-care is tied greatly to play. My kiddo's still pretty young, and so she's always challenging me to get into the imagination, the creativity, the flexibility, and the play, which is so good for me and so hard some days. I have been also cultivating a practice around yoga that I've just found incredibly supportive in so many ways, not only through classes and community, but also just for me personally. Having that connection between the mind and the body. It can feel, very spiritually supportive as well, which I enjoy. So I think, really for the most part, it's this idea that I work when I work and then I live the rest of the time. And we're not trying to pack our life full of all kinds of extracurriculars, all kinds of shoulds, really trying to hold this space for more of an organic flow in our life, and building connections, building community, which of course is difficult. And just incredibly necessary.
Yeah. That's also lovely. And I think for the therapists who are tuning in, especially young therapists, like prioritizing that. I think when I was a young therapist, I did a good job of like self-care. But like I didn't have kids yet.
Right.
You know, like there were aspects of it that were easier when I was a young clinician. I worked across the street from a gym. I took 3 hours, 3 times a week to go to the gym in the middle of my day, which was like
Lovely.
lovely and also super unsustainable for when you have kids and you do some other things. So, like, I think I had this idea of self-care, but I didn't have kind of what you're talking about and what I have now of like living, of like,
Mhm.
here's your set schedule for work, and work is not the purpose of your life. Work is a means to an end. And it's
Yeah.
nice that you have work that is meaningful and helps people, but also like it's to pay your bills. And so, what are you
Yeah.
doing outside of work, and how do we make that time and space
Mhm.
healing, healthy, fun? I talk about like self care as the bare minimum, not the goal, and that like cultivating joy and having those spaces in our life are just as, if not more important.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think too, as a starting clinician, I wasn't great at self-care. It usually was like emergency self-care when you're like, oh, I am really not okay. I'm going to have to take some time or make sure I do, a little bit of this and that to kind of get my tank back up to full.
Sure.
Um, but I think too, it really is for me now more of a practice, a daily awareness of like, okay, how am I doing today? What's
Mhm.
going on? What do I really need? Because I'm also the type of personality that will have kind of these set things that I would do in quotations for self-care, but it's not always what I wanted to do or what I actually needed. So I'm really working on creating that space too in my life where I can like, okay, today's the day I actually have more energy and I'm feeling okay. And like, I'm going to get this done and I don't have to pour as much into, whatever else it may be.
Yeah.
And then also those days or those weeks where it's like, I am running ragged, I'm too thin, I'm going to need some extra time for some care and some
Yeah.
space for rest and really knowing what's in my toolbox for that.
Right.
Because I think too, self-care just becomes another thing on our to-do list and it's not actually serving the purpose that it should serve.
Yeah.
So being aware of what that's like, even for me,
Yeah.
has been, really, really important.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up. I see a number of either medical professionals or other mental health professionals in my practice, and we talk a lot about intellectualizing your self-care, which is the thing that I can talk about because I did it for years, where it was that box to check instead of like, is this a experience for my body? Am I going through it? Am I feeling it? Or is it just I checked that box, so I'm good?
Yes,
And those are two different things.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, we could go on for longer. There's so many things to dive into and talk about here. Amber, if people want to learn more about your practice, if there's a therapist
Mhm.
out there who's interested in doing a training with you, if people want to find you, where do they go? Where's all your stuff
Mhm.
located?
Yeah. Well, I camp out a little bit on social media. So that's at nonordinary.therapy. If you're looking on Facebook or Instagram, those are really, there's too many for me
Sure.
to keep track of. So those are my primary. If you want to go to my website, you can either go to nonordinarytherapy.com or my full name, amberkerby.com. That's Kerby. But you'll
Yeah.
find me, type it into a search engine. There's not too many of us out there practicing ketamine assisted therapy or psychedelic assisted therapy, especially in Iowa. So those are probably the two primary ways to
Yeah.
get connected.
Yeah. And you post regularly. Instagram's where we first connected. So you're active over there.
Yeah,
And we'll have all those links and things in the show notes for people as well.
great.
Amber, thanks so much for taking the time and talking today.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for just giving space for these kinds of conversations and for inviting me. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, awesome. And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks again for tuning in this week. We'll be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.